I still remember the glow. Not the kind that comes from fireworks or a summer bonfire, but the bluish humming glow of our living room television, pulling us toward it like moths around a porch light. It was September 26, 1960, and everything was about to change, though none of us quite realized it yet. It was a Monday night, and dinner had barely cleared the table when Dad wheeled out the television like it was a sacred artifact. We had a 21-inch RCA Victor with rounded corners, rabbit ears reaching skyward, and it sat in the corner like a polite guest, quietly commanding the whole room. Mom dimmed the lights. My kid brother Doug tried to sneak a soda, and I, 15 and full of teenage cynicism, plopped down on the shag carpet with my arms crossed. Politics bored me stiff, or at least it had until that night. "Boys," my father said, adjusting the rabbit ears, "you're about to witness history." He wasn't wrong. On that flickering screen, John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon were about to meet in the first ever televised presidential debate. Kennedy, the young senator from Massachusetts with a smile that seemed painted on by Norman Rockwell himself. Nixon, the sitting vice president, already a household name thanks to his dogged style and his ever-present 5 o'clock shadow. Two men, one future, and a million eyes ready to judge not just what they said, but how they looked saying it. We weren't the only ones watching. Across the country, 70 million Americans tuned in. That's nearly 2 out of every 3 adults. Imagine that. Think about how quiet the streets must have been. Bars, laundromats, diners, all transfixed by 2 men in suits standing behind podiums in a bland Chicago studio talking about the fate of the free world. But it wasn't the content that shook people. Not at first. It was the presence, the poise, the polish. Kennedy looked like he'd just stepped off a yacht. Tanned, confident, clean-shaven. The man didn't just speak, he performed. He looked right into the camera, like he was talking to each of us individually right there in our living rooms. He wore a navy suit that caught the studio lights just right. Calm hands, straight back. He had a softness in his tone, but steel in his message. Young, idealistic, determined. Then came Nixon. He looked tired, gaunt almost, recovering from a recent hospitalization, and stubborn as ever. He'd refused makeup, saw it as vanity. But under those harsh lights, vanity might have helped. He wore a gray suit that faded into the studio background, and he seemed to look everywhere but at the camera, at Kennedy, at the moderator, at his notes. "Why does Nixon look like he's melting?" Doug asked, slurping his soda. Mom shushed him, but we all chuckled. The makeup that Kennedy wore gave him a camera-ready glow. Nixon? He looked like he'd just jogged to the studio. But here's the thing, on radio, Nixon won. His answers were sharp, grounded, confident. His arguments held water. If you only heard the debate, as millions did, Nixon came across like the seasoned statesman he was. But on TV, Kennedy stole the show. That night proved something no pollster, no analyst, no campaign strategist had fully understood yet. Presentation mattered. Style mattered. Television wasn't just a vessel, it was a weapon. A candidate could now win hearts not just with policy, but with posture. And believe me, that was a hard pill for my father to swallow. "He's too slick," he grumbled during a commercial break. "Nixon's got more experience, more grit. But Kennedy's got more, I don't know," I replied, watching the senator adjust his tie between questions. "Presence." Dad glared at me like I'd just complimented a Red Sox player in a Yankee house. But I could see it in his face. He was unsettled. Not because Kennedy looked good, but because he looked presidential. And Nixon, despite his credentials, looked weary. In that 1 hour, American politics left the print era and entered the age of image. And it wasn't going back. Now here's something folks didn't talk about back then. But you learn these things over time. Kennedy's team had practiced every possible camera angle. They knew how to light him, how to frame his face. Nixon's crew, not so much. They were still playing chess while Kennedy's team was making a movie. Even the temperature in the studio, over 90 degrees thanks to the bright stage lights, played a role. Kennedy stayed cool. Nixon? He sweated like he was on trial. That infamous upper lip of his gleamed with perspiration, and the cameras didn't miss a beat. By the end of the night, something had shifted. Not just in politics, but in our living room. My mother, who'd always been apolitical, said softly, "He reminds me of Roosevelt, in spirit, not just speech." And I, a young, cynical, self-absorbed me, felt something strange. Hope. Not because I knew his policies or understood the economy. Heck, I didn't even understand my geometry homework. But because he made me believe that maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't beyond repair. That maybe with the right words and the right light, you could speak something new into being. And that, my friend, is where our story really begins. Before the cameras rolled, before Kennedy's jawline became the stuff of legend, there was a backstage. And let me tell you, that Chicago studio backstage wasn't the polished command center you'd imagine today. No stylist with earpieces. No branding consultants whispering authenticity every 10 seconds. Just heat, nerves, and the low hum of a nation holding its breath. I wasn't in the studio, of course. I was 15 and rooted to my living room like the TV antenna on the roof. But over the years, as the behind-the-scenes details came out, interviews, documentaries, anecdotes told in smoke-filled dens, I pieced it together like a jigsaw puzzle on a rainy afternoon. And now, when I close my eyes, I can see it like I was there. The year was 1960. The Cold War was humming, the suburbs were booming, and the nation stood on the edge of something new. But back there, in the dressing rooms of WBBM-TV, it was just two men and their team, prepping for a fight not with fists, but with poise, posture, and a stare into the camera lens. Nixon was running hot, literally. He'd been hospitalized just a few weeks earlier for a nasty knee infection, and he looked like a man trying to pretend he wasn't in pain. In his dressing room, aides were trying to convince him to put on makeup, and Dick, always the fighter, always the scrapper, said no. Now, let me explain something. Television in 1960 wasn't kind. The cameras were massive, the lights were hotter than the Florida sun in July, and every pore, every twitch, every bead of sweat was captured in brutal honesty. Nixon thought makeup was a frill, a cosmetic trap he wouldn't fall into. But politics was no longer a radio show, it had become a performance, and Dick Nixon hadn't read the script. There's a famous story about how Nixon bumped his knee on the way in and refused to sit down in the green room. He stood, pale and shadowed, waiting for his turn like a boxer backstage, trying not to limp. He looked into the mirror and didn't see what we saw. Now over in Kennedy's corner, a whole different story. Jack Kennedy was a man born for the spotlight. That wasn't just about charm, it was discipline. He was wearing a crisp navy suit that his team had chosen precisely because it popped on black and white TV. His shirt was starched, his tie was centered, and yes, he wore a light touch of stage makeup, not vanity, strategy. While Nixon paced and scowled, Kennedy sat, calm, hands folded, legs crossed. One aide recalled that Jack barely looked at his notes. He'd already memorized what mattered, and instead of rehearsing policy points, he practiced eye contact with the camera. That's the part that hit me when I learned it years later. While Nixon looked at the moderator, Kennedy looked at us, the people in the living rooms, the families with frozen casseroles on their plates, the veterans, the kids like me. He didn't just answer questions, he addressed a nation. BBM-TV Studio One in Chicago wasn't built for this, not really. Sure, it had lights and cameras, but it wasn't ready for the emotional weight of 70 million eyes. The studio lights pushed the temperature over 90 degrees. You'd have thought they were launching a rocket in there. Technicians scurried, producers whispered, and in the center stood two podiums, two stages really, and history waiting to be made. In came Kennedy, straight back, relaxed brow. He walked like a man taking a stroll, not entering a battlefield. The audience murmured. Then Nixon, slower, paler, his legs still sore, his body still weak. He nodded politely but didn't smile much. That famous Nixon scowl, it was already forming. The moderator cleared his throat. The red light blinked on. And just like that, everything changed. Back home, our family watched it unfold like a play. But what we didn't see, what the cameras couldn't capture, was the psychology crackling beneath the surface. Kennedy had studied how to talk to the camera. Nixon had studied how to talk at the room. And that difference, it was everything. You could almost see it when the first question landed. Nixon looked over, spoke confidently, even nailed his answers, but looked like he was searching for a blackboard to write on. Kennedy, meanwhile, looked into the barrel of the camera like it was an old friend. We were mesmerized, not because he said something magical, but because he made us feel seen. And in 1960, that was rare. My dad sat frozen in his chair. He was a Nixon man. Law and order, he'd say. Loyal. Smart. But that night I watched him fidget. I watched him scratch his chin when Kennedy spoke. I saw him cross and uncross his legs. It wasn't just what Kennedy said. It was how he looked saying it. Doug, my brother, didn't care about politics. He was 7. But halfway through, he looked at me and whispered, "Why does Nixon look like he's going to cry?" I shushed him, but the truth hit hard. That's when I realized this wasn't a debate. It was a performance, an audition for who America wanted to stare at for the next 4 years. And Nixon, for all his grit and grind, wasn't built for the spotlight, at least not this one. I don't think I truly understood what was happening until the moment the camera cut to a split-screen shot. There they were, Kennedy and Nixon, side by side. One looked like he'd just stepped out of a magazine cover. The other looked like he'd just come back from a 3-day stakeout. It was almost unfair. Nixon was sweating. His gray suit blended into the backdrop, his jaw clenched. Kennedy, cool, crisp, confident. He didn't blink more than he had to. In my living room, you could hear a pin drop, except for Doug, who had decided to lie upside down on the couch and whisper, "Why does one of them look like a ghost?" My father gave him a look. But it wasn't just us. That was the night America realized something it hadn't before. You could know things. You could say things, but if you didn't look the part, you'd already lost half the crowd. You've probably heard that old stat, the folks who listened on the radio thought Nixon had won. That's true, to a point. He sounded like a seasoned leader. He knew the facts. He laid out his policies. But here's the thing. Television was a new beast. It didn't just want substance. It demanded style. Television made politics visual. And when politics becomes visual, everything counts. Your posture, your color choice, the gleam in your eye when you deliver a line like it's a punchline and a promise all in one. Kennedy had it. Nixon didn't. Simple as that. And yet both were saying largely the same things: civil rights, the economy, foreign policy. They debated Cold War strategy, farm subsidies, missile gaps. But none of that would stick in the minds of Americans like Kennedy's tan, his teeth, and his trust me smirk. It wasn't fair, but it was real. That night, style meant substance, and beat it 2-1. I remember looking over at my mother during the second half of the debate. She had her knitting needles in hand, not because she wasn't watching, but because that's how she processed nerves. Her foot tapped, her eyes never left the screen. She whispered, "That boy is going to be president someday." She meant Kennedy, and she said it like she already knew. Not because of what he'd promised, but because of what he projected. Authority, optimism, youth, hope with a haircut. It was the first time I realized we weren't watching a debate. We were watching casting day for the role of leader of the free world. Later, I'd read about polling data from that night, how a Gallup poll taken just after the debate showed a shift, slight but seismic. People weren't switching parties. They were leaning, hesitating, reconsidering. Kennedy had closed a gap in 1 hour that Nixon had taken months to build. In political war rooms across the country, phones rang off the hook. Pollsters and consultants scrambled to understand it. In living rooms, it was simpler. People didn't say, "I've reconsidered my stance on NATO." They said, "He seems more confident," or "He looks like a leader." Or, and I remember this one clearly from our neighbor Clara down the street, "He's got the kind of face you trust on a bad day." That was the moment it shifted. Elections wouldn't just be about ideas anymore. They'd be about images. There's a photo from that night, taken just after the debate ended. Kennedy's walking out, shaking hands, smiling. Nixon's in the background, hunched slightly, sweat-darkened shirt collar, jaw clenched. He looks like a man who didn't lose, but who realized the rules had changed, and he hadn't been told. In later years, Nixon would blame that night for his loss. Was it the only factor? Of course not. But it was enough of one. Because that was the night millions of Americans saw, not just heard, the future. That debate wasn't just about Kennedy and Nixon, it was about us. It was about who we were becoming, a visual people raised on television, fed by imagery, learning to judge not just on what we were told, but on how it was framed. After that night, no presidential candidate would take the screen lightly again. Makeup artists became campaign staff. Lighting consultants got pulled into briefings. Camera angles were debated like foreign policy. Politics had gone Hollywood, and none of us could look away. The sun rose on a country that hadn't quite realized it had changed. My alarm clock clicked on at 6:45, same as always, and the AM radio sputtered into life with a tinny version of Perry Como. I was halfway through brushing my teeth when I heard it. And in last night's first ever televised presidential debate, that's when I jogged back to the living room in my socks, nearly wiping out on the linoleum. I flicked on the Zenith. The local anchors were already replaying clips. The camera panned to Kennedy's face, calm, clear-eyed, leaning ever so slightly forward in that I'm listening posture. Then it cut to Nixon, dabbing his upper lip with a handkerchief. And just like that, the narrative was born. I walked to school that morning, and even that felt different. Folks at the corner barbershop weren't talking about the Dodgers. They were talking about posture and sweat and Kennedy's cool-as-a-cucumber vibe. "I tell you, Lou," one man said through a cloud of cigar smoke, "that boy looked like a movie star. Like Clark Gable with a cause." At the diner down the road, Betty, the waitress who'd been topping off my hot cocoa since I was 10, leaned across the counter and said, "I think I just saw the next president of the United States on my black and white last night." And she wasn't talking about Nixon. That was the story everywhere, not what was said, but how it was seen. Now, don't get me wrong, the newspapers tried to play it even. The headlines the next day were your usual suspects. Both men hold firm on policy positions. Kennedy and Nixon clash on Cold War civil rights. First ever televised debate marks new era. But the photos told a different tale. Page after page, Kennedy stood tall and camera ready, his tie crisp, his face evenly lit. Nixon? That poor man looked like he'd fought off a fever and lost. The makeup he refused to wear, a point of pride, supposedly it made him look washed out and wan. You didn't need to read the editorial to know who won. You just had to look at the pictures. That's what Earl, my neighbor who worked down at the GM plant, said as he mowed his lawn later that week. I laughed, thinking he was joking. He wasn't. My TV voted, he said again, wiping his brow. Didn't even wait for me. It was funny at the time, but in hindsight it was prophetic. Because for the first time it wasn't just about what you stood for, it was how you stood, how you carried yourself, how the living rooms of America saw you when you thought you were just answering a question about Berlin. The television had become America's new truth filter, and for better or worse, it didn't blink. There was a moment, right about halfway through the debate, where Nixon spoke about his time as vice president. He listed countries he'd visited, leaders he'd met, decisions he'd helped shape, and Kennedy, he just nodded. When it was his turn to speak, he didn't counter. He simply said, "The question before us is which point of view and which party do we want to lead the United States?" He let the camera do the rest. That single sentence, calm, direct, no notes, cut through the living rooms like a razor. I remember sitting back in my chair, goosebumps on my arms, realizing this guy knows how to use silence. It wasn't just politics, it was theater. Campaign managers saw the polls shift within days, not dramatically, but undeniably. Before the debate, Kennedy had been the fresh-faced underdog, the Catholic kid from Massachusetts with too much charisma and not enough experience. After, he was a contender, a serious one. The Democratic base fired up. Young voters, a term still finding its legs back then, leaned in. Even a few of my father's poker buddies, staunch Republicans for life, started muttering things like maybe he's got something. It wasn't that Nixon had failed. It's that Kennedy had arrived. The Thursday after the debate, we had a mock election in my high school civics class. Now keep in mind, this was Texas. This was oil country, church-going country, Nixon-loving, Eisenhower-worshiping country. But when the ballots came in, Kennedy, by a landslide. Our teacher stared at the results and said, "Well, that's unexpected." Doug, remember Doug, my upside-down couch brother, just whispered, "TV don't lie." Now my household was split. My mother was all in for Kennedy after that night, my father on the other hand. Still Nixon, still the man who'd stood with Eisenhower, who'd known war, who'd gotten his hands dirty in international affairs. "You can't trust a pretty face," he'd grumble over his newspaper. Mom would smile and say, "Sometimes you can." The tension never came to blows, just quiet debates over dinner, sideways glances during Sunday broadcasts. But even that tension was new. Television had come into our home and turned a private decision into a public conversation. Looking back now, it wasn't just a debate. It was the moment American politics changed forever. From that day on, campaigns weren't just about policies, they were about presence. They were about being seen, not just heard. The debate was over, but the show had just begun. I don't think I'll ever forget the look on my mother's face the night the returns came in. She sat on the edge of the couch, apron still dusted with flour from her famous pot roast, gripping the edge of a throw pillow like it might fly out of her hands. My father stood behind her, arms folded, jaw locked tight like a man watching the final inning of a tied World Series game. The Zenith TV glowed like a shrine. And across the country, in gas stations, diners, Navy barracks, and beauty salons, millions of Americans were doing the exact same thing, holding their breath, waiting for a new kind of tomorrow. Election night, November 8th, 1960, felt different from the others we'd lived through. Maybe it was because so many of us had seen these men in action just weeks earlier, had watched them not just speak, but exist in our homes. Kennedy's voice still echoed in the back of our heads like a favorite song. Nixon's tension still crept up our spines like static on a sweater. My Uncle Roy brought over an extra radio just in case the antenna went haywire. My Aunt Louise showed up with Jell-O salad and 3 kinds of pie, because if we're going to pick the next president, we're doing it full and sugar-loaded. The kids, all of us cousins, were told to settle down or go outside, but none of us moved. This wasn't just about grown-ups anymore. This was history unfolding in real time, and it was ours to witness. I remember the moment Illinois came in. Our living room erupted. For weeks, the state had been a dead heat. Kennedy had fought hard in Chicago, shaking hands, kissing babies, holding rallies with Sinatra's music blaring from flatbed trucks. Nixon had banked on the downstate vote and the quiet trust of farmers and veterans. But when the announcer leaned in and said, "NBC Projects Illinois for Senator John F. Kennedy," my mother screamed like the Beatles had just walked through the front door. My father didn't say a word, just scratched his head and walked to the kitchen to refill his coffee. It was like watching 2 tectonic plates shift under the same roof. By midnight, it was clear this wasn't going to be a blowout. Every network had its own board of states, some blue, some red, and most in that maddening, too close to call gray. California, Ohio, Michigan. They danced across the screen like poker chips tossed in slow motion. The anchors, buttoned up, breathless, kept saying things like historic turnout and unprecedented tension, but we didn't need them to tell us. We felt it in our bones. It was a battle between two versions of America, one looking forward with hope and slick suits, the other rooted in experience, war stories, and wary pragmatism. I remember one broadcast, cut away to a BBC feed, a London news anchor reporting that the pubs were still full at 3 a.m., crowds glued to televisions, watching the fate of the Western world unfold. Soviet newspapers had been running cynical editorials all week, speculating on what either outcome might mean for the Cold War. Even down in Havana they were watching, radios crackling with coverage as Castro's Cuba braced for whoever would step into Eisenhower's shoes. And I'll tell you this, even at 15, I knew this was bigger than Nixon versus Kennedy. This was about image versus instinct, youth versus establishment, black and white versus technicolor. It was almost 3 a.m. when we saw the moment. Walter Cronkite took a deep breath and said it. At this hour, with key states breaking towards Senator Kennedy, the path to 270 electoral votes appears likely. Mom burst into tears. Dad muttered, "I'll be damned." Doug and I, we looked at each other like the world had just flipped. Kennedy hadn't officially won yet, but you could feel the tide pulling. A generation had held its breath, and now it was exhaling. That night, phones rang off the hook in our neighborhood. People who hadn't spoken in weeks were suddenly calling each other. "Did you hear?" "Can you believe it?" Old Army buddies congratulated each other. High school debate clubs were already claiming they'd called it first. Church groups planned a prayer for unity. College kids blared jazz from their dorm windows. Even in the Deep South, where Kennedy's Catholicism had stirred suspicion, there was grudging admiration. "He kept his head," one caller told a local radio host, "and Lord knows we'll need that." When the morning paper thudded onto our porch, front page screaming, "Kennedy wins," my father stood there staring at it for what felt like a lifetime. He didn't say anything, just carried it inside, folded it carefully, and placed it in the top drawer of his desk. He never admitted it, but I think in that moment he understood what the rest of us had felt weeks earlier. That history had turned the page. Kennedy's victory wasn't massive. It was razor thin, the closest since 1916. But it didn't feel small. It felt inevitable. Like the country had looked into the camera lens, seen its reflection, and decided to try something new. A president born of the 20th century. A leader who embraced the lens, not just the pen. A man whose rise wasn't through smoke-filled backrooms, but through televised poise and youthful ambition. And that scared some folks. But for the rest of us, it was like watching the future arrive in high fidelity. It didn't hit me right away. Not in the confetti or the campaign buttons. Not even in that grainy morning paper with Kennedy's smile taking up half the front page. It hit me a week later when we were at the grocery store. My mom was elbow deep in the produce bin, picking through oranges, and I wandered off toward the magazines. I flipped through a Life cover with Jackie Kennedy in a powder blue coat holding the hand of a little girl at a rally. And right there, wedged between the gossip rags and World War II retrospectives, was a new kind of headline. Television, the Kingmaker. That's when I knew. We hadn't just watched an election. We'd witnessed the birth of something new. Before 1960, politics was something you read about. It happened in smoky Senate chambers, on newsprint, through wires and telegrams and the occasional radio address. But now, it was in your living room. It was in your face. Kennedy wasn't just a president-elect. He was the first TV president, and he knew it. He stood like a movie star and spoke like a teacher, and whether you liked him or not, you watched him. You couldn't help it. The camera loved him, and he loved it back. Now, to be fair, Nixon wasn't done, not by a long shot. The man came back swinging in later years, and eventually he claimed the Oval Office on his own terms. But that first debate, it haunted him. He later admitted he'd underestimated the power of television. That night he'd refused makeup, refused rest. He looked gaunt, pale, like a man cornered in a hospital hallway. And while the radio audiences thought Nixon had won on substance, the television viewers, 70 million strong, saw a different story. They didn't just hear the answers. They saw the sweat. They saw the darting eyes. They saw doubt. After that, no politician made the same mistake. You could feel it in the way they walked, the way they held their hands during speeches. Suddenly, every stump stop had a camera crew. Every press secretary had a lighting guy. Every jacket was tailored. Every smile rehearsed. America had changed its mirror. We no longer looked to the podium. We looked to the screen. And the screen, it showed us everything. You have to remember, back then there was no internet, no streaming, no YouTube algorithm deciding your bedtime. There was just the box. One channel at a time, one national conversation. And that living room, that was sacred ground. It's where we debated over meatloaf, where dads grumbled and moms sighed, where kids peeked between the fingers they were told to close over their eyes. Television didn't just broadcast information, it bound us. It gave us common ground, the same jokes, the same tears, the same heroes. Kennedy knew that, and so did every president after him. Of course, history didn't stay shiny for long. The 60s unraveled fast. Vietnam, protests, riots, assassinations. Camelot cracked at the edges, and our trust in that screen, well, it got complicated. By the end of the decade, we were watching tanks roll through college campuses. We were watching astronauts walk on the moon and wondering what it all meant. The screen was still sacred, but now it showed us everything, even the things we didn't want to see, even the things we couldn't forget. But that night in 1960, that first debate, that was still magic. One night, the country had watched the future arrive, pressed up against the glass, eyes wide, breath held. 2 men, 1 camera, and 70 million souls leaning in. It wasn't just politics. It was performance. It was presence. And from that moment on, presence became policy. Sometimes I wonder what my father would say about politics now. He never quite trusted the screen, said it was too easy to fake a smile, too tempting to hide behind slick production. But he watched, didn't he? He cared. He argued. He yelled at that Zenith like the men inside could hear him. And he never missed a debate after 1960. Not a single one. Legacy in every lens. Today, kids carry the whole world in their pockets. Every speech is a TikTok clip. Every campaign trail stop is a meme. But the DNA of modern politics, it traces right back to that September night in 1960. The moment Kennedy leaned into that camera. The moment Nixon blinked just one too many times. The moment America realized that how you say something matters just as much as what you say. Maybe more. We still feel it. Next time you see a candidate smile just a second too long, or dodge a question with polished ease, or pause dramatically before a soundbite, tip your hat to that stage in Chicago, because that's where it started. That's where America learned to vote with its eyes. And as for me, well, I still keep that Life magazine tucked between my old baseball cards and my father's watch. Sometimes I pull it out, flip to Jackie's photo, and think about that night. The TV glow, the popcorn, the hum of a nation daring to imagine itself differently. And I smile, because I was there. I saw the first real spark of modern America. And it flickered, bright and bold, right there in our living room. Back when remote controls had legs, ours. And if the rabbit ears weren't working, well, you were the antenna. We didn't just watch histories, we squinted through static and made do with lukewarm TV dinners. If that brought back a memory or two, don't worry. I've got plenty more where that came from. Stick around, we're just getting started.